So before I get to the other factors that researchers discussed when talking about incarceration rates, I just want to point out some of the criticisms that were, wielded against Bloomstein and Beck for their perspective. And so a guy named John Pfaff came out and basically reviewed the book that Bloomstein and Beck put out and basically said that they used a faulty process in their statistical analysis, that they hadn't really derived any empirical data, and there were key faults in the way that they had derived the data. They weren't controlling for certain variables that were leaving holes in their data. And so he actually referenced another researcher named Yair Listokin. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but Miss Listokin basically did an empirical, analysis of different data points, and found a correlation between increased crime rate and increases in incarceration. She found that there was a 1% positive correlation between crime and incarceration. And so, what she was able to conclude from that was that even if all things else were equal, because of the rise in crime between the 1970s and about the 1990s, there would have naturally been at least an 80% increase in incarceration. The problem with that became that in that time period, crime or incarceration had actually increased by over 500%. So there's about a 420% gap, which basically suggests that there were other factors at play contributing to the rise in incarceration. Researchers like Michelle Alexander, who wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, basically denied the criminal theory and said that crime does not dictate incarceration rates, and she went for what's called the political theory. The political theory basically ties purposeful political agendas to the legislation that was passed that got more people incarcerated over this 30 or 40-year period. And so she basically uses kind of an anti-criminal theory to set up her argument that politics were basically targeting minorities via the war on drugs, and sending more people to jail. Now, the criticisms of that perspective are also coming from John Pfaff. And John Pfaff basically says that even if you took all the people who were impacted by the war on drugs and sent to prison by the war on drugs, that would only attribute to about 20% of the people incarcerated in that time. And so if you took all of those people out, there would still be an incarceration problem. And so he basically concluded that the war on drugs was not the single leading factor contributing to higher incarceration rates, simply because there's only 20% of the total population of the total prison population serving time for drug offenses. So from there, you kind of get the two main perspectives. You get the criminal theory and the political theory. As I got deeper and deeper into the research, I realized that the criminal theory and the political theory were actually very closely tied. There were a lot of things that these researchers agreed with each other on, in terms of they all agreed that incarceration had climbed not for just one reason. Michelle Alexander basically attributed most of it to the war on drugs, but at the same time, she did recognize that there were other factors at play. John Pfaff recognized that demographics were at play, politics were at play, and that crime was at play, but he didn't want to lean too heavily on any one of those perspectives being the leading reason for rises in incarceration. And so kind of creating common ground between those perspectives were different institutes who came out. One being the Brookings Institute. A guy named Jonathan Rammel was able to take Michelle Alexander's perspective and take John Pfaff's perspective and kind of blend the two in a way that really explained what was going on with this problem of high incarceration rates in America. What he basically figured out was that John Pfaff was not correctly attributing the stock and flow of a prison system when he said that only 20% of people in prison at any given time were, there for drug offenses. John Pfaff always makes this claim that over 50% of the people who are serving time for violent crimes. And so for us to really have reform, we have to focus on those violent offenders. But in the Brookings Institute article, the argument is made that John Pfaff, by disqualifying the stock and flow, is not correctly analyzing the data. So kind of what John Pfaff did to Bloomstein and Beck gets done to him. And with that stock and flow, it basically gives us new data that shows that in any given year, over 30% of the people admitted to prison are there for drug offenses. And so they're going to be there a shorter amount of time than someone who's there for violent crime. So if you just take a snapshot of the prison population, you're going to see over 50% of the people there are there for violent crimes. But if you actually look at the stock and flow, you're going to see that the majority of new admissions are from people who are serving for drug charges. And so that kind of gives some credibility to what Michelle Alexander postulates. But at the same time, the Brookings Institute article goes on to say that John Pfaff does have some credibility with his argument that even if you accounted for all of the people who were drug offenders, there would still be, you wouldn't really be solving the problem of high incarceration rates. And so when we look at reform, as I kind of wrap this up, when we look at reform, it's important that we focus on, decriminalizing drugs. There were several articles that mentioned there were different ways that we can handle people who were using drugs or on drugs. One particular researcher found that over 50% of the people who go into prison have consume some sort of drug outside of tobacco and alcohol in the 30 days prior to them arriving, and that only 14% of prisoners who have some sort of drug dependency are actually treated. There's also research to suggest that drug treatment is actually more cost effective than law enforcement. And so when we're looking at reform, we do have to understand that no drug, focusing just on the drug epidemic won't get us all the way to an incarceration rate that we'd like. But at the same time, it is a good start, and it will prevent a lot of people from going to jail in the first place.